Chris Jordan has a question. Go.
I'm wondering if you can, as you work through the examples, address a criticism that I often face when I'm trying to sell this framework and these examples, is that, well, it's all well and good for Joe because he works in the desert. You can't, all of us in the wet side of the world, you can't see these things from space, and you can't do these kind of assessments because an aerial imagery or satellite imagery won't reveal these features. That's not to say you can't do it on the ground, but it makes it so much less palatable because you can't do the original, the initial desktop or maybe all of your work from imagery. So can you either think about that as we go through these examples, or maybe in the small groups, what are the lines of evidence that one can see from aerial imagery when you can't necessarily see the ground as easily, or a brown-green line never exists because it doesn't get brown?
So it's a great question. It's a fair point. It is true that all lines of evidence, individual data sets, etc., in particular contexts, they can fall apart, right? Maybe it's not good enough. Some of these, I would say, well, have they actually tried yet? And have they actually used it in some of those settings? But there will be breaking points of individual methods. And we're not going to talk about that at all. I don't want you guys going there in the discussions. I don't want to digress into the framework other than to acknowledge that there are lots of different methods, and there's virtually no method that doesn't have places where it's going to perform poorly, or you could have a really good method. It's just that the data that's available performs poorly. We want to focus on the concept and whether or not the concept breaks. And so you already, sort of had the concession from those naysayers that it's like, well, yeah, if I go there on the ground. Well, spoiler alert, monitoring, we're usually going there on the ground. So I could care less if my stupid remote sensing tools don't get us all the way there. They get us in the ballpark for a lot of places, and then you might have to roll up your sleeves and do some field work. Cry me a river. So I really don't want us to go there, not because it's not important and it's not a fair critique, but I just don't think that's where we go off the rails and get into our classic debates, within protocols and questions about the methods and, yada, yada, yada. What I can tell you is that you could give me an answer if you went there. Do you buy that, Chris? Or is that too defensive?
It's a wee bit defensive, but it's a fair
that's
point.
Joe's personality. So
yeah, exactly. I was expecting that.
Yeah,
but
yeah.
I guess
that's why Jeremy's here to temper me down.
So, but I guess my point being that a lot of the lines of evidence that you presented are drawn from intact systems in drier environments. And so not to say that we're going off the rails of critiques, but I'm wondering about widening that list of lines of evidence.
Oh, yeah.
To include a wetter base.
But that's
context.
Not what we're doing here. The examples that we use for dumbed down, classroom exercises like this, use some of those high contrast things because it's easier to see. Okay, and we should show some other examples, etc., etc. They don't fall apart as quickly when you get out in the field, and the point of this is that you can have it is the choice of the person doing the monitoring or the assessment, or formalizing that into a protocol because it's done so often, to find what's appropriate for them and choose what you're going to use there. And so you may use a very different set of indicators in a semi-arid or an arid environment, a very different set of specific methods, I should say, to get at some of these types of things in those different settings. There's a really helpful principle that I know you're aware of, Chris, in river styles of, you don't use necessarily the same set of geoindicators everywhere, right? Depending on the flavor or the type of reach that you're working in, or, you know, I'm working in the desert versus, you know, in a temperate environment back east, you would curate a set of geoindicators that's appropriate for that. And so what the, yeah.
Joe,
Right. So,
I'm
so
gonna
let me interrupt you.
I'm gonna pull you out of the
Yeah, just-
weeds. All right.
All I'm
And
asking, Joe, is that we have a list that's doing exactly what you're saying, but let's develop a list that allows, not exclusively, that works for all situations, but just like the river styles context, let's explore these lists and say, oh, in a wetter place, this is the kind of thing you'd look for. In a drier place, this is what you look for. I'm not asking that there be a single rule set to bind them all, but in these conversations that we're having with this group who have lots of examples in their head, how would you use this concept and identify the things on the ground or the things from space that
appendix
you would
in the
look
framework, and
That's
it's
all.
a perfect suggestion, and let's talk about it tomorrow morning, because that's, I think, a good place for it, because the framework should demonstrate that it's possible in lots of places and give people that idea. So that's a really good suggestion.
So Joe, I'm going to move you along and get to Jen here in a minute, but do me a favor and pull up your slide on the exercise that we do to delineate a valley bottom, because I feel like you're jumping, you know, 7 steps ahead of maybe where people are. And so I want to ask this question. Actually, like,
keep talking.
You know, I kind of want to get a pulse of, you know, a lot of these folks have been through the workshop and whatnot, but that workshop has also been an adaptive learning thing where we change the content based on what we do out there and apply new concepts all the time. And so I don't think we should assume that everybody knows how to map a valley bottom according to the process that you've outlined here. And so step 1, I think, is never to overlook the importance of this part of it right here. Because for me, when I came to, and we connected and saw the new potential of a riverscape beyond what it is today, this was game changing, okay? And so I think you're gonna have to start your framework with a description of how to map a valley bottom.
Yeah.
Right? And I don't think that should be taken for granted. The second piece is, to Chris's point, dividing a riverscape valley bottom into channel, active floodplain, inactive floodplain needs to be better defined, right? And so what does that really mean, and how would we measure that? And so some folks have suggested elevation, and that may be something in a wet environment where everything is greener and green. Maybe that's something you lean into more, right? To help you understand where is a place in this riverscape that's flooding regularly. And so I think you're getting some good feedback on just being a little more explicit about how those things conceptually should be mapped in the field or even remotely. Like, I could see when you ask about the evolution stage, we could give you a ballpark estimate just guessing right here, but when I've done that and I go out in the field, you'll adjust that, right? Like, oh, I see that it's widening here and we're probably in a different stage than I thought. Yeah. So, you know, the initial desktop exercise plus a field investigation is fairly reasonable to expect on most projects.
Yeah, so it's great points, Jeremy. Forgive me, partly in the interest of time. What I was trying to suggest is either you're people who know how to do this or have heard this from me before, or if not, go follow these videos. And also I can put the link up to the video for reading riverscapes in the field. But you're spot on that this is the importance. And the steps, you know, get out the Crayolas, right? Look at, you know, this and start with mapping the channel. Then maybe map some of the things that are part of the valley, but not the valley bottom. And then trying to go through and map this based off of the topography as well as the vegetation that you're suggesting. what's interesting, and part of the reason I wasn't going through that exercise is because I was just going to take people to an imperfect approximation of that, which is our valley bottom extraction tool that'll get us in the ballpark with nationally available data. And this, by contrast to what Chris was saying, does work well across, you know, any of the physiographic settings that we're working with. The vegetation and seeing some of the other things, those are better critiques. So that's why I was skipping over that.
my approach, Joe, which is to always explain the why before the how. And where I see you going is the how, and what people are going is, tell me why does that matter? And so I think if we back up for a second and just make sure, yes, the valley bottom is a key concept. We're going to talk about the framework, how to map that. Yes, we agree with you that active, inactive floodplain is an important distinction. Then we can figure out how to map that.
Okay.
So, you know, that's where I think I'd just hit pause for a minute. But yeah, Jen, you had your hand up. Did you have something you wanted to contribute?
I can wait till tomorrow if it's more appropriate. But I was just going to throw out, I think a lot of these concepts are really interesting, could be really useful. I think there may be, and I might have missed it, but a step missing in the beginning to say this is for more complex reaches. There are lots of river settings that don't have complex reaches and floodplains. And so I'm assuming you're kind of fast forwarding to using this tool in the reaches where this is more applicable to try and identify that riverscape of where's our floodplain, how do we define, but we also work in a lot of other ones. And then I do really like, I'll just echo Chris's idea, and it's hard, you know, because you don't want to be a classification system, but it's just, you're creating a tool that can be robust and flexible, right, for many settings. And so you just need some outs. We call it like the 1040 easy form or something, like you need some outs if it's not applicable in a certain setting, or if you have a more complex setting, what are alternative you know, options to think about, or highly modified, you know, where you may need another out to do a deeper dive. And I'm sure, like in your mind, you're on that whole highway with exits and paths, and I think it's just it's really cool that you're making this effort, because people are it's gonna be a great tool, but like I just see, you know, sometimes there's like those of us who've done it for 20 years or something, you're like, yeah, I could run out of the field, and like based on my experience, and I do my things, you know, what does it look like versus a new person who may, you know, like what could go wrong? You know, maybe another way to, like on the Thursday discussions, like this is amazing. How might someone misapply it? Oh, okay, that's where we need to fill the gap. And I think I think what you're getting at, like in my mind, I keep going back to like a conceptual model. And so you're really trying to like use readily available information, do a conceptual model, and then people can spin off and do these deeper dive things. But you need to be able to know, where is it straightforward, where do you have more uncertainty, and where there's risk, you know, because sometimes there's very little risk, sometimes there's a lot, you know, infrastructure, people, what's going on. So I don't know, those are just some thoughts that have been going through my mind, and
those are great.
Appreciate all of this great energy, you know, and just want to pass that along. Like conceptual model may be a term worth using.
Yeah, and this, I love you're definitely perceiving, you know, I mean, right, what we're trying to do is align the conceptual models that we're trying to, you know, agree on in principles, etc., with methods that can be fed from free available data that's there, or the best data you could get your hands on, or forget the models and use the brain and go out and apply those things. And so one of the problems that gets confusing here is I am not hoping or suggesting that the tools that we are trying to develop are what everybody should use. But I am suggesting that the concepts for those that are interested in being able to consider the question of, is my riverscape healthy, are useful, and that there's a bunch of ways, including some pretty simple ways that we're going to explore right now, that can get you in the ballpark and help you think about that question.
That's the part, Joe, that I think just my pulse on the group is like, what are the conceptual model ideas for how we would, what are the indicators we could use that tie to the principles? And so you laid out a few, right? Which is the concept of a valley bottom. The concept that that valley bottom has active floodplain areas, which we all know flood regularly, and we have others that have been disconnected for a variety of reasons that are not just terraces, right? So, you know, and then there's the structure idea. We talk about structure. Well, could we measure that? Yeah, we have ways that we could look at that. And so I think if I were to pull a group back up and say, don't worry so much about the tools or the way in which we'd measure it, because that could be like even more detailed tomorrow discussion. You talk all the time in the class about, look, forget the tools. Like, let me just show you the concepts in a crayon and a piece of paper. And so that's where I feel like this group needs to start is, are those concepts right? Are they the right indicators, the right types of things? And so I would say keep going, but keep that in mind as we're working through this, is it's the concept, like this is how we could do it related back to this principle.
Well, and so this first exercise, I'm asking everybody to just bear with me on, here are some indicators. I'm not asking if this is the final list, if this is the indicator you should use everywhere. I think what the framework is how do you put sideboards on how people choose the indicators that work for them, for their purposes and their riverscapes, to, in essence, populate the rows of some sort of spreadsheet like this. But based off of how yesterday went, I'm trying to, you know, get us to come into these very specific riverscapes and specific examples, so that this afternoon, when people meet in groups, then they can open that up a little bit. They can zoom to whatever reach that they want to in one of these places, and start to play those games. And it won't be, because I didn't give you PDFs, it won't be Crayolas. It'll be looking at the screen, turning on and off some different layers, and making some of those calls. Does that make sense? Looks like Karen has a question or a comment.
Yeah, it just in looking at this, I think in one angle it's great, and it ties the health, the principles of health to the indicators of that health, and then moving to restoration and, you know, this whole, and then trend monitoring. My concern is that if things like structure are a principle of river health, and process-based restoration builds those structures, I feel like we're measuring what we're doing, and that always bothers me. And so I just see that right across this table, and it and I always call people out on that, and so I just want to be really careful that we're not doing that.
Weber, are you on? Could you, that's a great point, Karen. And so could you maybe describe this if you're still here? Nick, and just to, in case you didn't catch it, Karen was talking about if one of our indicators might be a count of structures, and this just digresses into, well, the structures I built, i.e. artificial structures. Immediately what came to mind is this graph, and the goal is not the count of structures. The goal is some self-sustaining and fluctuating amount of beaver dams, and beaver dam activity being the process. Can you unpack this, Nick?
Yeah, well, I think it's a good example that it's, you know, the indicators are not going to fit every project. And so, I mean, this is just conceptually, you know, we want this handoff to, you know, two natural dams over time, but in our case, we've chosen this indicator as the sum of natural and artificial dams, which being, for this system, this particular project, a reasonable indicator that fits our project timeline and fits our long-term expectation. So, but just an example. I think graphically, this is what we're talking about today.
So if you were to use the count and you lumped them together, that would be the red line. The artificial dams are artificial until a beaver takes them over, and then then they're co-opted or they build new ones. And so we're trying in that case. And so it's hard because it's a great reminder, Karen, of the same indicators. This idea that's in the river styles framework of you don't use the exact same indicators in every single riverscape. It's what Jeremy elevated in that little preamble to the principles of the context matters. And a way that we can think about what the framework is attempting to do is help people choose an appropriate set of indicators for their riverscape, and if applicable, if it's an action effectiveness thing, for their management activities and or restoration.
I think, it gets back again to Chris's comment of, well, Joe works in the dry side and he can see the floodplains. And well, okay, so you can't. Well, then don't choose that as your indicator.
Yeah, I did do my PhD in the UK, so whatever.
Okay.
But, yeah.
and maybe beavers aren't an appropriate fit, a beaver population for your area. Well, okay, it's just going to be, in this case, you are going to be the disturbance as structure and dams, and your expectations for beaver supporting the structural treatments are different.
Yeah.
We're not saying, I guess what we're saying is your indicators are going to really depend on your context, right?
That's right.
Yeah.
That's right.
But the framework should work.
Yep.
I would just add that trying to understand the point that was made, but I don't think it's problematic to count the things we restore as part of putting this on a trajectory that we want. We do this all the time with riparian planting. We plant vegetation and then we quantify the recovery of that system over time. And that doesn't mean that those things are completely artificial and unnatural, but what we're doing is kickstarting the system, hoping it takes over. And so clearly you want a self-sustaining system that actually functions on its own, right? Riparian plants reproduce and they get recruited through flooding and all of that. We want beavers to take over these structures. We want wood accumulation on PALs that is independent of what we're doing. But I don't think it would be problematic to use metrics of structure, to kind of say, where are we at today? What do we expect post-restoration? Where do we want to be if the system actually takes over?
And the sort of a good way of thinking about the framework is, because another fair critique would be like, oh, well, those guys only ever talk about and only ever work in systems where beaver. I'm working in a system where beaver, there's no capacity to support beaver. They weren't there natively, etc. So what do? Well, I delete those two rows, okay? Is it a system where wood is important? Well, maybe not. Maybe it's actually a system like Nick mentioned yesterday, and I'm working in some meadows, and sometimes they have channels and sometimes they don't, and there's discontinuous channels. And so maybe instead of jam density, maybe what I'm looking at is some sort of, rhizomatous root mat, production, which maybe is like, I'm going to use some mapping, and it's, percent of VB or, whatever. I'm mapping out those areas where there's, sedge mat production. Or I'm using an actual measure of productivity inferred from, some sort of NDVI analysis. There's, and so I'm actually going to use, units of biomass per time. Whatever it is, what we're trying to do is provide the guardrails on the framework for, if you're trying to choose some indicators that speak to riverscape health, how do you make those appropriate choices to come up with what you want to do. We're not trying to say this is the final list, but like I like Chris's suggestion of, hey, in different settings, these might be some of the indicators that are helpful.
Joe, I'd like to just make another comment on kind of the usefulness of kind of going through this process. And, you know, like I just saw somebody write down root mass production as being maybe a reasonable indicator sometimes. And, you know, somebody might say, well, how are you going to measure that? And we're going to say that a lot about a lot of indicators, but still going through this process, even if they maybe are difficult to measure, setting those expectations sometimes becomes just a very, very valuable communication tool, even if you think you're going to have a lot of trouble quantifying them. It still can allow you to compare to, say, other places that have a totally different potential. So, you know, I think sometimes just getting too caught up on the kind of precisionism into things and the practicality of actually measuring these things, you know, you don't always have to get completely lost in those weeds.
And to your point, Weber, that is a really good sort of like encouragement to, I mean, so yeah, this could be 0 to plus or minus whatever, or, you know, some value plus or minus whatever. It could also be a range, you know, this to that. So I feel like what you just said is an invitation to don't freak out. You know, of course, this is going to be more tightly bound the existing than trying to make that estimate for the historic and for what's possible. Those can have much bigger ranges because we don't know, but that's still a helpful communication tool. And don't make the focus all on being right. And there's safety in having multiple rows here. If you came up with one of these and you had one indicator table and you said this is all that mattered and I should use this everywhere, then you know then we're in trouble. Maybe it's 12:22. Maybe we could not try to rush into something before lunch on the rest of examples, and just if there's any other comments people would like to share or concerns or what have you. But I feel like, Jeremy, where you kind of pulled us up here to just kind of hash this about, maybe just get a sense as to how people are doing with that, and then we'll go through these couple of exercises after lunch.
Yeah, I mean, you know, one could actually just walk through without any detail to say, for this type of principle, we're using things like this, and this. And then let me show you after lunch how we can measure those things. I think let's get the juices flowing and then break for lunch.
Yeah, Damien, I think I was about to say, I can do that real quick too.
Oh, yeah, I just wanted to mention, follow up on Karen's comment. I think just maybe she was getting at delineating, you know, what we're doing versus what the system's doing, you know, what the system is designing. And that's the recovery part that is, you know, critical to call out that the differences there.
I mean, and you could, for your purposes, if it was, you know, a restoration thing, right? You know, make sure you differentiate the natural and the constructed, right? And so then when you set your expectations in a design context, you know, every column is basically just a snapshot in time. So we're going to build, you know, there's not going to be a single natural dam there, and we're going to build, you know, 50 fake ones, you know, plus or minus 5. And after a few floods, we expect a few of those to, you know, go away. But then, you know, we might hopefully, you know, after a few floods, and if beaver moved in, you know, maybe we've got, you know, 10 plus or minus 20. I don't know, right? Whatever it is. I mean, that I think is a good example, Damien, that you and Karen are highlighting. And we're not trying to prescribe exactly how people do that, but just the framework sort of explain how you can tailor those things to what makes sense for your assessments, for your monitoring. Chris, I'm reluctant.
Yeah, you're going to get to the point where you're just ignore whenever I raise my hand.
No,
so I want to ask
no,
Jeremy's
you always
question.
have good things.
I want to ask Jeremy's question. Before you get into the how, why? So this is a table of numbers. So why view it in this quantitative sense? What's the end goal of quantifying, even with measures of uncertainty, which I love, but where's this going? Because that gets to all of the kinds of questions that Nick was raising, Weber was raising about over precision, or even the need for any precision at all. And that goes back to, I guess, the first comment I made yesterday about why do we do monitoring if we don't know what the question is? And so why? And then why jump to quantification? Does this feed into a tool? In which case, do we need to see that before, or is that the surprise reveal after everyone's been dragged through the how?
That's a great question, Chris. Are you wanting to answer, Joe?
No, he asked you. He definitely doesn't want me to answer.
Oh, well,
No, I didn't. I said I was asking Jeremy's question that
question.
Jeremy always asks of you.
Yeah, and we're trying to force
go to the
you
how,
to.
Joe, let's do the why.
So,
Well, 'cause
I can
Jeremy,
help
you do
you
it,
on
Jeremy.
this. I'm going to help you on this, and you tell me if I'm wrong. Because we need a way to communicate expectations. We need a way to not only communicate, but set expectations and communicate them, whether that's project partners, permitters, whatever. I think about, we need ways to somewhat quantify uplift. If we're doing restoration projects, we need to be able to demonstrate that what we're doing is actually a net benefit and not a degradation, right? And so in the NRCS world, we have, that doesn't have to be super quantitative, but there should be some way. And then, I could see maybe a further level of why being, somebody really wants to quantify the outcomes, like, from a methodological, scientific, rigorous way. They want to be able to say, we increased this by X%. That is a whole other level of detail and rigor. But, when it's NRCS, I'm just going, hey, I just want a way to walk out there and say, this riverscape should be better than it is today. And I don't have a way to really do that. So what did I miss, Joe? That would be my why.
Nothing. We're trying to improve riverscape health, and we can just run around and say, yeah, it's better because I said so, and I think so, and I feel so. But sometimes that is good enough, and all of us know that.
I think this goes back to what maybe Chris had mentioned earlier about difficulty with regulators. I could see that very much being the case if our entire paradigm for viewing streams has been what's growing along the side of the channel. And now all of a sudden we're coming in and saying, well, you're not using your imagination. It should be wet over there and wet over there. And so we have to start at ground zero to say, what should we expect here from using that geomorphic background we now have to say, hey folks, let's walk you through our logic. Jessica.
I thank you for all this, and this is super valuable. I think Chris, and a few things are coming up, like the stream restoration community is coming from a background of a very engineered, let's count how many rocks we put in the river type of monitoring. And I would like, I'm glad we're having this conversation, because I would like to see this effort be really aware of those pitfalls and not get into like, well, I planted 14 willows, so I need to count those 14 willows and track them through time. Like, right, we're trying to get at something bigger. How are those willows improving the health of the system? So I get that we need to have these indicators kind of called out and kind of give people something that they can quantify. And maybe these are the right things, but but I think we should be so aware of kind of chasing what our predecessors have done in counting so much of how we change the system instead of the health of the overall system.
I'm just doing backflips, Jessica, because I'm coming from different disciplines, as I mentioned yesterday, where we've termed this the precisionism problem. And every one of our disciplines is guilty of it. Even, river ecologists, not just engineers, but every one of us wants to reduce the system down to such a tight precision range, and we're always wrong. The more we study it, the more we're wrong. So I think you're absolutely onto something, that there's higher level things we can do that keep us out of being wrong more often. And I'm going to dump this paper in the chat if anybody's interested, but like, this has a long history across disciplines. What you just talked about
in the references too, Jeremy.
Okay.
And Jeremy, you always say that there's some NRCS language that you always use. I just in the chat called it difference between effectiveness measures and measures of actions and effort, but you actually have some terminology for that. I always forget.
I'm trying to remember what that is. I don't recall.
Well, the difference between how many acres I treated and how many structures I built, which is a measure of effort.
Yeah. So, outputs versus outcomes. And outputs are acres and feet and numbers and miles of things, which are important milestones for tracking our progress. But ultimately, people want to know, what did we get? What was the outcome? What was the upshot of this? And that's where, we need some ways to do that. Let's go to Alden real quick here.
And to Jessica's point, our outputs should be focused on true measures of riverscape health, right? So.
Yeah, I guess just from the land management perspective, we're required to manage the landscape to achieve certain standards. Those would be ideally in the future brought down to what we define as landscape or riverscape health. And then the guidelines prescribe ways of evaluating that. We can't be arbitrary and capricious in the way that we say that we're achieving them by doing various actions and prescriptive management, et cetera. We have to have a reasoned line of evidence to support those. And so we need different scales of information, whether we're assessing things that are big, broad scale and providing some conceptual ideas of how things are progressing. We still can't just use just straight up subjective opinion. There needs to be some metric that we're looking at, and that helps hone our staff into reading the riverscapes as well. We can then delve deeper if we're going to go to the project level, but at a fundamental level, if we're going to say that this is what a system is, if it's healthy, we need some sort of way of describing that to the public to support our positions. Otherwise, we can get called out in court, and we do frequently get litigated on it.
I'm going to call on Timmy if she's on and paying attention. Timmy, are you there?
I'm here. I'm afraid.
So
go ahead.
Yeah, I'm way out of my league. She's our aquatic ecologist, but from an NRCS standpoint, can you weigh in on this too? Like, why would we want these types of? Why do we need a framework to measure these types of principles and concepts?
Well, I think we've talked about it a lot along the way, and your outcome position is certainly good. But at NRCS, we deal with a lot of folks that, their expertise is not watersheds and river health, and they have to be able to say, how is this better? So we're fighting with this on two aspects. On the front end, we've measured, how many sticks and stones and how wide is the channel and how deep is the channel. And that's just not accurate, and kind of that context that we have isn't accurate. So how do we get away from that and put it into the buckets that you put out this morning? Those 3 buckets I think are fantastic, but there's got to be some way, what is I don't have your 3 buckets in front of me, but what is because the word drives Nick so batty, inefficiency mean. How do we put our arms around that? So again, are we hand waving, or how are we documenting that this is better? What does health look like?
In our conservation planning process, we're going out on private lands and helping agricultural producers try to determine is there a resource problem or not? So you can't answer that question without some type of an assessment. And if we want to bring a new paradigm to this idea of riverscapes, then we need a way to communicate that what you see out there is either on the mark or not, or how far from the mark is it. And so anyway, I've probably enough said on our process, but that's what I'm saying this aloud, because I think we as a community have to communicate that why first in this framework, or otherwise you're going to lose people going straight to tables and products and tools without explaining why this type of thing is needed.
You may lose our community. My fear is that we don't lose the outside community, and they do go directly to measuring, but not really understanding what they're measuring and why. So.
Okay, Alden and Chris, do you still have your hands up?
Yep. Yeah, I put my hand back up.
Chris.
So I want to very strenuously object to all the underlying tenets of the last 2 minutes of conversation, that not quantifying something means hand waving, and that quantifying means that you can then manage towards it. We are in the place that we are right now because the science geeky world says you don't know something unless you put numbers on it, and that's just patently wrong. And the problem is that if you put numbers on it, then we end up in these systems where people obsess about the numbers, and that can either be manipulated in terms, sort of gaming the system in terms of, I'm going to optimize my outcomes by raising my numbers, but they're meaningless, right? So you don't end up with your objectives because you're focusing on the quantification. And so what I think a challenge of this task in front of us is to make it rigorous without defaulting to the rigor being demonstrated with quantification. And so we and everyone has said, oh, I have to have numbers for my management paradigm. Okay, then that means that we're not being driven by what is the right thing to do. We're being driven by an ill-informed management process, right? So how do we change that culture rather than just being enabled by that culture?
Well, Chris, you could take any of these things and you could find some words where you qualitatively came up with that. Now, I mean, it's interesting if we look at like SVAP or, how many of these things have, when they've tried to stay qualitative, they still actually go to a 1 to 5 or a 1 to 10 scale, which, that's interesting. But I think that, if we're talking about things like, our measures and metrics and scratch that, our indicators are going to be in units that are like, acreage and, anything that you might tend towards needing dimensional analysis on. Okay, I'd be sort of with you. I think if the indicators that we're going with are things like, proportion, where it's scaled then to a valley bottom, which is already providing something, or their counts, and they're things that can be expressed with big ranges, you could still walk up and just say, yeah, there's a lot of beaver dams there, and pat yourself on the back. You could still walk up and say, I don't know, there's like 15 plus or minus 5 dams because I didn't get in and count everything. It's really freaking messy. And be okay. So I don't know. I fear that the concern that you're bringing is I think it's valid, but I feel like it's better to place that in the precisionism concern as opposed to framing it as quantitative or unquantitative, because I don't think you're going to win. People still pretend that they want numbers. So, I mean, we can speak to that in the framework a little bit, but just to go the complete opposite end and just say, well, it should all be qualitative, I think we'll lose far more people than you gain
I didn't
for
say
the
it should be
downsides of
qualitative.
this.
I didn't
Well,
say it
then
should be
what's-
qualitative. I think it said it should be. I'm not answering. I'm not giving you an answer because I don't
Okay.
have one. But I'm giving you a challenge that is not to default to, to numbers to demonstrate, as opposed to you're really trying to get across concepts. And you're trying to get people to recognize the concepts in health. I mean, just look at what the goal is watershed
But
health.
If
There
I'm
is
talking,
nothing as nebulous as the word health. And
let's talk about
but
audience,
that's
Chris.
exactly what we want to do.
Chris, let's talk about audience. Who's the audience for this monitoring stuff? Okay, who goes and does the monitoring, and then who do we actually report those numbers to? When we're talking to producers and landowners and managers and stuff, we're just going to keep it in those qualitative terms. But sometimes those things are far more compelling when there is, actually a measure, that's behind that and backing it up. So I think we can address your concern by, realizing that just because we might have some currencies that are more accepted in more scientific communities doesn't mean that there is not a real easy conceptual translation to how we just speak about this in lay terms. Jeremy, rescue us.
I'm going to, because what Chris is saying, I believe, is something you've heard from me before. And this is more a cautionary tale. And just, I think we all need to be aware, the more detailed this gets. We have lots of examples. I see Mark put a book in the chat. I mean, every single field suffers from this same problem, the tyranny of metrics, and how, this over precision problem. So I think he's not wrong. The more we try to optimize these systems, the worse it's going to be for the system. And we fall into that trap of just doing what we've always done. And so I think the pin in the notepad is we better be damn careful about how prescriptive we are in these numbers, because that's not the game we want to play, nor is it the message we want to send. However, I would recommend you go ahead and pull your horrible table back up, and just before lunch, we'll break, as soon as you're done, but talk big picture about here's the principle and here are the types of things that we could potentially measure to have this conversation about. Why do we need to do something? Where are we at today? Where would we go with management?